Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. Silas had always been a dedicated employee. Hardworking, punctual, reliable. He was the kind of person people barely noticed in an office, the kind who blended into the background, did his work, and went home. At least, that's who he used to be. Everything changed the day he met Vera. Vera wasn't just his manager. She was perfection. Smart, poised, confident. She walked through the office with effortless grace, commanding respect without demanding it. Every meeting, every email, every decision flawless. Silas had admired her from a distance at first. Admiration turned into fascination. And before he realized it, fascination turned into something much darker. He told himself it was harmless. Everyone had a work crush, didn't they? It wasn't wrong to admire someone, to want to impress them, to care about what they thought. But Silas's admiration wasn't like the others. He didn't just want Vera to notice him. He wanted to be part of her world. Silas became attuned to Vera's every movement. He memorized the sound of her heels clicking against the floor, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking. He noticed what kind of coffee she ordered, the perfume she wore, the color of her lipstick. Silas made sure to be wherever she was. If she got coffee at 8:15 a.m., he did too, always managing to be right behind her in line. If she stayed late working on reports, he volunteered to stay late too. If she took the stairs instead of the elevator, so did he. At first, he convinced himself it was coincidence, that it was just a sign that they were meant to be close. But Silas didn't believe in coincidences. Not anymore. It started small. Silas began tailoring his interests to match Vera's. When he overheard her talking about a book she loved, he bought it the same day and read it in one sitting. When she mentioned her favorite cafe, he started going there every weekend, hoping to run into her outside of work. And when she spoke about personal struggles, long nights, stress, deadlines, Silas felt like it was meant for him. She was opening up to him, even if she didn't realize it yet. Silas wasn't satisfied with just watching Vera at work. He wanted more. He followed her online presence, learning everything she shared. Instagram. He scrolled through her vacation photos, her brunch outings, the casual selfies in front of a mirror. LinkedIn. He read every update, every article she liked, trying to understand her ambitions, her motivations. Facebook. He dug into old pictures, old friends, old memories, piecing together the story of who she was before she became Vera Langley, the manager. Each piece of information felt like a gift, like she was unknowingly giving him a deeper glimpse into her life. And Silas made sure to collect every piece. The first time Vera noticed him, really noticed him, was when he complimented her on her favorite book. She had tilted her head in surprise, smiling. "You've read it?" Silas had nodded casually, heart pounding. "Yeah, it's incredible. Your recommendation." She had laughed, seemingly charmed. "I didn't realize I was influencing my team's reading habits." That moment stuck with him. It was proof that she saw him, proof that he was meant to be part of her world. But Silas wanted more. One evening, long after most employees had left, he noticed Vera's office door slightly ajar. Inside, she was sitting at her desk, rubbing her temples. Exhausted. His heart ached for her. He wanted to do something, say something, so he stepped inside. "Long day." Vera looked up, startled. She hadn't heard him come in. That was the first time she looked afraid. A flicker of something uneasy passed across her face before she masked it with a polite smile. "Silas, you're still here." He nodded. "I was finishing up some reports. Saw your light on." She hesitated, just for a second. Then she smiled again. "That's kind of you to check in." Silas held on to those words like a lifeline. She thought he was kind. That meant she liked him, didn't it? From that night on, Silas began pushing the boundaries. He sent late-night emails just to see if she was still working. He waited for her in the parking lot after work, pretending it was coincidence. He started watching the security cameras at work, monitoring when she arrived and when she left. She hadn't rejected him. Not really. So maybe she just needed time to understand. to see that he was the only one who truly cared. One night, Silas saw Vera's car parked outside a small bar downtown. Through the window, he saw her sitting at a table, talking to another man. Something dark and unfamiliar curled inside his chest. Was she ignoring him? Had she lied about how tired she was at work? Did she not see what was right in front of her? Silas's grip tightened around his phone as he stared at her through the window. He had been patient, understanding, but maybe it was time to show Vera just how much he truly cared. Silas sat at his desk, fingers poised over his keyboard, pretending to work while his gaze flickered toward Vera's office. Her door was slightly ajar, just enough for him to see her silhouette as she leaned over her desk, focused on whatever important task consumed her. He loved these moments, watching her when she thought no one was looking. There was something intimate about it, something that made him feel closer to her in ways she couldn't possibly understand yet. She was beautiful even in concentration, her brows slightly furrowed, lips pursed in thought. He wished he could read her mind, know what she was thinking about, know what kept her up at night. He knew he had to be careful. It wasn't like before, when he could admire from a distance without worry. Ever since their brief late-night interaction, he sensed something different in her. There had been a flicker of hesitation, a moment where she had seemed wary of him. It unsettled him. He needed to make sure she felt safe around him, needed to regain that trust. But how? Silas had spent hours thinking about his next move. He couldn't push too hard, couldn't make her think he was anything other than the dedicated, dependable employee she had come to know. He needed her to see him as someone she could rely on, someone she could confide in. The way she had smiled at him in that moment, thanking him for checking in, he had to bring that back. He started small. Whenever she walked by, he made sure to greet her, a warm yet subtle acknowledgement that wouldn't seem out of place. He offered to take on extra work, anything to lighten her load. At first, she had waved him off, but after some insistence, she began accepting his help, thanking him with that same polite smile. It wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed something to make her think about him when he wasn't around. One evening, long after most employees had left, he waited. He lingered at his desk, pretending to wrap up a project as Vera gathered her things. She always stayed late, often one of the last to leave. As she walked past his desk, he glanced up and feigned surprise. "You're still here?" Vera chuckled softly. "I could say the same about you." He shrugged, stretching slightly. "Figured I'd finish up a few things before calling it a night. You work too hard, you know." She let out a small sigh, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "Part of the job, I guess." He took a chance. "You shouldn't walk to your car alone this late. Let me walk with you." She hesitated just a moment before nodding. "That's really nice of you, Silas." That was all he needed. As they stepped into the parking lot, he let the moment stretch between them, letting the cool night air settle over them like a shared secret. He asked about her day, listened attentively as she spoke, offering sympathy when she mentioned the stress of deadlines, giving small words of encouragement that made her smile. He memorized the way she looked under the dim parking lot lights, the way her hair caught the glow of the street lamps. When they reached her car, she turned to him with genuine appreciation. "Thanks, Silas. Really, I appreciate it." He smiled, forcing himself to keep it casual. "Anytime, Vera. See you tomorrow." She nodded before slipping into her car, driving away into the night. Silas stood there, watching until the red of her taillights disappeared. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through him. He was getting closer. She was letting him in. He just had to be patient. The following week, he escalated things just slightly. When he overheard her mention her favorite coffee order to a coworker, he made sure to bring her one the next morning, brushing it off with a casual, "I grabbed an extra, thought you might like it." She smiled at him then, real and warm. "Wow, you didn't have to do that. But thank you, really." That smile stayed with him the entire day, looping in his mind like a song. He started learning more. Every tidbit of information was a gift. Her preferred news source, the music she hummed under her breath, the specific way she liked her desk arranged. He made mental notes, storing everything away for later use. Every day, he made sure to incorporate small touches into their interactions, small signs that he understood her more than anyone else. But then came the setback. One afternoon, as he returned from lunch, he saw Vera standing near reception, laughing with him. "A man." someone he had never seen before. Tall, confident, charming in a way that made Silas's stomach tighten with something ugly. He had never thought about competition before. The idea of someone else being close to her, of someone else making her smile like that, it made his skin crawl. He couldn't look away. The way her hand lightly touched the man's arm, the way she tilted her head when she laughed. It was too much. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms, forcing himself to breathe. He couldn't panic. Not yet. He had to be smart about this. That night, Silas did something he had never done before. He looked him up. He found the man's name, his social media accounts, his work history. A co-worker from another department. Someone who, by all appearances, was harmless. But Silas knew better. He had to be a threat. Why else would Vera be smiling at him like that? Silas sat in the dark of his apartment, staring at the glowing screen, heart racing. He needed to find a way to remove this distraction. He needed to make sure Vera's world remained exactly as it was, with only him in it. Silas barely slept that night. The image of Vera laughing with that man looped in his mind like a broken reel, each replay sharpening the ache in his chest. He had spent so much time ensuring that he was the one she relied on, the one she trusted. But now, someone else had appeared. Someone who had effortlessly claimed her attention in a way that Silas had worked so hard to achieve. By morning, his exhaustion was drowned out by a growing resolve. He needed to act, and he needed to be careful. The last thing he wanted was to make Vera think he was jealous, even if he was. When he arrived at the office, he took his time settling in, strategically waiting until he saw Vera enter. She looked radiant as always, but something about today was different. Her eyes flickered with an energy he hadn't seen before. Had she been thinking about him? Or was it the other man? Silas clenched his jaw. He had to refocus. He had to remind her who truly understood her. Mid-morning, he found his moment. Vera was standing by the coffee machine, scrolling through her phone. He approached with easy confidence, holding a document in his hand, as if it were just another routine conversation. "Morning," he said, keeping his voice casual. She glanced up, offering a distracted smile. "Hey, Silas, how's your morning going?" "Better now," he replied smoothly, then held up the document. "I wanted to run this by you. Just a quick clarification on the numbers from yesterday's report." She nodded, taking the paper from his hands, her brow furrowing slightly as she scanned the figures. "Ah, I see the discrepancy. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for catching that." His heart swelled at her appreciation, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I noticed you left late last night. Everything okay?" Vera let out a soft chuckle. "Yeah, just some last-minute prep for the next quarter. You know how it is." His stomach tightened. She was lying. He had seen her leave. She hadn't gone back to her office. She had met that man. Still, he smiled. "You work too hard." She shrugged. "It's part of the job." Before he could respond, the moment was interrupted by a familiar voice. "Vera! Hey, there you are." Silas turned as the man from yesterday, Grant Keller, strode toward them, all confidence and charm. Vera brightened, her smile widening as she greeted him. "Grant! Good morning." Silas felt something bitter twist in his chest. He stepped back slightly, gripping his coffee cup tightly as Grant gave Vera a quick rundown of an upcoming project. Then, the worst part. She laughed. Not the polite, office laugh she gave coworkers in passing. A real laugh. Silas stared, his vision tunneling in on the way she looked at Grant, the effortless ease between them. He knew it then. This was more than just a casual work interaction. Vera was comfortable with him. Too comfortable. The realization sent a cold wave over Silas. He had worked too hard, been too careful, to let someone like Grant waltz in and take what he had built. He needed to do something. That night, he found himself parked outside the company lot, watching as Vera left the office. She walked alone, her bag slung over her shoulder, oblivious to the fact that he was just a few yards away, hidden in the shadows. His heart pounded as he trailed her from a distance, careful not to get too close. She was headed toward the parking structure. The perfect opportunity. Just before she reached her car, he stepped out from behind a pillar, his voice deliberately light. "Vera!" She turned sharply, eyes wide with surprise before recognition softened her features. "Silas, what are you doing here?" He feigned a sheepish grin. I was just finishing up some work and saw you walking alone. Thought I'd make sure you got to your car safely. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Oh, that's really nice of you. He took a step closer. It's a dark lot. You never know who's out here. She let out a small laugh, though it felt more cautious than usual. I think I'll be okay, but thanks. He nodded, standing by as she unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat. As she pulled away, he watched her taillights fade into the distance, his pulse thrumming with exhilaration. She had let him be there. But more importantly, he had planted something in her mind. He had made her aware of how vulnerable she was. And soon, she would realize there was only one person who could truly keep her safe. Him. Silas couldn't stop thinking about the way Vera had looked at Grant. The warmth in her eyes, the effortless way she laughed around him. It gnawed at him like a relentless ache. It wasn't fair. After everything, after how much time and effort he had put into making himself the perfect person for her, Grant had somehow slipped in unnoticed, disrupting what Silas had so carefully cultivated. For days, Silas kept a watchful eye, his focus entirely consumed by every interaction Vera had with Grant. He noted when they lingered together after meetings, how often Grant passed by her office for casual conversation, how her body language shifted ever so slightly when he was near. Vera never acted this way with anyone else. Silas needed to regain control. The first step was information. He spent his lunch breaks combing through Grant's online presence. A quick search on the company's employee database gave him everything he needed: Grant Keller, age 33, marketing director. From there, he found his LinkedIn profile, which listed his previous jobs and education. But it was his social media that painted the most interesting picture. Grant had an Instagram full of travel photos, trips to Paris, Tokyo, and Santorini. A Facebook account that had remained relatively inactive except for tagged photos from mutual friends. And Twitter, where he occasionally shared articles on marketing trends. None of it was useful. But then Silas found something interesting. A post from an old friend wishing Grant a happy birthday. The comment section revealed what Silas had been looking for: a past relationship. A woman named Ava had commented something playful, the tone laced with nostalgia, and Grant had responded in kind. Silas dug deeper. Ava Middleton, a successful event planner in the city. Beautiful, poised, well-spoken. She and Grant had been together for nearly 4 years before their relationship ended. Why had it ended? That was the question Silas needed answered. Ava's profile, unlike Grant's, was more open. With enough scrolling, Silas found a post from 2 years ago. Some things are meant to stay in the past. It was vague, but the comments below made it clear. The breakup hadn't been amicable. Silas smirked to himself. This was it. By the end of the day, he had everything he needed. He drafted an anonymous email, carefully wording it as if it came from someone concerned. A friendly warning, nothing more. He attached a link to Ava's old post and sent it to Vera's work email. Then he waited. The following morning, Silas noticed something was different. Vera was quieter, more distant. When Grant approached her desk, she didn't greet him with the same enthusiasm as before. Her smile was there, but it was smaller. Forced. Silas watched with satisfaction as Grant seemed to notice too, his brow furrowing slightly before he walked away. It was working, but it wasn't enough. Silas needed more certainty. That evening, as he lingered in the parking lot once again, he saw Vera leaving the office later than usual. She was alone, her phone pressed to her ear. Silas inched closer, staying just out of sight. He couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but from the tension in her shoulders, he knew it had something to do with the email. Good. She was questioning things. A few minutes later, she climbed into her car, driving off into the night. Silas let out a slow breath, his mind spinning. He had successfully planted a seed. Now, all he had to do was wait for it to grow. But something unexpected happened the next morning. When he arrived at work, he saw Vera standing outside the building with Grant. They were talking, seriously, intensely, and Silas' stomach twisted into knots. Had she confronted him? Had Grant managed to talk his way out of it? He watched as Grant placed a hand on Vera's shoulder, a gesture of comfort. Vera didn't step away. Silas clenched his fists. This wasn't over. Silas had expected Vera to pull away from Grant after the email. Instead, she had gone straight to him. That was a mistake. She was still too trusting, still too willing to believe in people who didn't deserve her trust. It wasn't her fault, really. She just needed guidance, someone to help her see things clearly. That someone had to be him. For the next few days, Silas watched and waited. Vera was still talking to Grant, but something had shifted. There was a stiffness in her posture, a hesitation in her words. She hadn't dismissed the email entirely. She was thinking about it. That was good, but it wasn't enough. Silas needed something stronger. That evening, he did what he had done many times before. He followed her. He had memorized her schedule by now, knew which days she left straight for home and which days she stopped for groceries or coffee. Tonight, she took her usual route, heading to a small bookstore downtown. It was quiet inside, the kind of place where she could disappear into her own thoughts. Silas lingered outside for a moment before stepping inside, careful to stay out of her immediate line of sight. He kept his distance, watching as she ran her fingers along the spines of books, occasionally flipping through pages. She looked peaceful. He imagined what it would be like if she knew he was there. If she turned and saw him, realizing that she was never really alone. Would she smile? Would she thank him for looking out for her? She wouldn't. Not yet. Silas turned away before she could notice him and slipped outside. He needed to plant another seed, something she wouldn't be able to ignore. He pulled out his phone and composed a new message. This time he made it personal. From Anonymous. Subject, just a thought. Do you really know the people around you, Vera? Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. He pressed send and walked away. By the next morning, it had worked. Vera was quiet at work, her usual warmth replaced by something more guarded. She barely spoke to Grant. When he approached her desk, she gave him a polite but distant response before making an excuse to step away. Silas watched it all unfold, satisfaction thrumming through him. She was listening, but then something unexpected happened. Late that afternoon, Vera entered the break room while Silas was making coffee. She hesitated for just a moment before speaking. "Silas, can I ask you something?" He turned to her, keeping his expression neutral. "Of course." She glanced around, making sure they were alone. "You've been here longer than Grant, right?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah. Why?" She sighed. "I got an email about him. Something vague. But it made me wonder if there's something I don't know." Silas forced himself to remain still, his heartbeat quickening. "What kind of email?" Vera shook her head. "I don't know. Just some cryptic warning. It's probably nothing, but it's weird, right?" Silas considered his response carefully. He couldn't push too hard, not yet. Instead, he gave her a thoughtful look. "I can't say I know much about his personal life, but I do know people have a tendency to hide things." Vera frowned slightly, her fingers tapping against the counter. "Yeah, that's what I was afraid of." Silas hid his smile behind his coffee cup. She was doubting him now. That was all he needed. Silas had never felt more in control. Vera's hesitation, her doubts, it was all unfolding exactly as he had planned. The carefully crafted emails had done their job, planting seeds of suspicion that were slowly taking root in her mind. Now, all he needed to do was nurture them. The following morning, Silas arrived at work earlier than usual. He wanted to observe Vera before Grant showed up. When she walked in, she seemed preoccupied, her brows knitted in deep thought. She didn't stop to chat with anyone, didn't offer her usual greetings. "Perfect." As she passed by his desk, he casually said, "Morning, Vera. You okay?" She paused, glancing at him as if debating whether to answer. Then she let out a sigh. "Just a lot on my mind." Silas nodded sympathetically. "I get that. If you ever need to talk, I'm around." Vera gave him a small, grateful smile before continuing toward her office. Silas watched her go, pleased. She was starting to see him as someone she could trust. But then, just as planned, Grant walked in. Silas tensed, waiting for the interaction. Sure enough, when Grant approached Vera's office, she barely looked up. When he spoke, her responses were short. The warmth in her voice was missing. She was pulling away. Silas knew he couldn't push too hard, not yet. He needed Vera to come to her own conclusions, to believe her instincts were warning her for a reason. He needed to apply the right amount of pressure, a gentle push in the direction he wanted. That evening, Silas sent another anonymous message, this one more pointed. From unknown subject. "Some people don't change. Sometimes we ignore red flags because we want to believe the best in people. But ignoring the truth doesn't make it go away." He imagined Vera reading it, feeling the weight of those words. He knew she would think about Grant, about his past, about whatever it was she feared she didn't know. The next day, Silas could tell something had shifted further. Vera seemed more distant than ever. When Grant tried to speak to her in the hallway, she excused herself quickly. She wasn't avoiding him yet, but she was close. And then, the opportunity presented itself. Silas was in the break room when he overheard Vera talking to a coworker about a restaurant she had been wanting to try. "I just haven't had time," she was saying. "Too much going on." Silas filed the information away. That evening, he made sure to casually mention the same restaurant within earshot of Vera, as if it had just come up in conversation. "I hear the food's amazing. It's a great place to clear your head." She glanced at him, considering. "Yeah, I was thinking about going this weekend." Silas smiled. "You should. It's good to take a step back sometimes." And just like that, he had nudged her away from Grant and toward a moment of solitude. Solitude that he could use to his advantage. The game wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. Silas had done everything right. He had set the pieces in motion, watched Vera slowly distance herself from Grant, nudged her toward isolation. It was working, but he knew there was still a risk. People have a way of fighting against what they don't understand, and Vera might still find her way back to Grant if given the chance. Silas couldn't allow that to happen. The next step required something more direct, something personal. That evening, he followed her. Not in a way that would seem suspicious, of course. He had done this before, staying a few cars behind as she drove home, watching the lights in her apartment flicker on from a distance. It was comforting, in a way, to know he was always there, even when she didn't realize it. Tonight, he took it further. He parked a block away and walked toward her building, his hands in his pockets, head down. He wasn't going to do anything drastic, just leave a subtle reminder that she wasn't alone, that she was watched over. At her doorstep, he slid a note under the door. Just a few simple words. "Some people don't deserve your trust." Short, impersonal, just enough to unsettle her. The next morning at work, Vera looked exhausted. Her eyes darted around more than usual. When Grant approached her, she barely managed to respond, and Silas felt a quiet thrill at the sight. She was doubting him now. But then something unexpected happened. Vera went to HR. Silas watched from across the office as she disappeared into the department's glass-walled office. His stomach twisted. Had she mentioned the emails? The note? Had she put the pieces together? He couldn't afford to take chances. That night, he sent another email, this time from a different anonymous account. From, unknown subject. "Be careful who you trust, even those closest to you can have secrets. Don't let your guard down." Vera saw it almost immediately. She sat at her desk, staring at the screen, then glanced over her shoulder, as if she could feel someone watching. Silas had to stop himself from smiling. She was afraid, but he needed to take it one step further. That evening, when Vera left work, he made sure to follow, closer than before. Just enough for her to notice a shadow behind her, just enough to make her steps quicken. He let her go home untouched. But he knew the damage was done. The walls around her were closing in, and soon she would realize that there was only one person she could truly trust. Him. Vera barely recognized herself anymore. The once confident, composed woman she had been was unraveling. The past few weeks had blurred into a haze of anxiety, stolen glances over her shoulder, and an unshakable feeling that something was wrong. It had started with the emails, cryptic warnings from an anonymous sender. Then there was the note slipped under her door, the shadow she had felt following her on her walk home. At first, she told herself it was paranoia. Stress. But paranoia didn't explain the way her instincts screamed at her that she was in danger. She had gone to HR, hoping for answers. But what could she say? That someone was watching her? That she was receiving anonymous messages warning her about the people she trusted? That she could feel someone lingering nearby in ways that couldn't be explained? The HR rep, though sympathetic, had little to offer. "If anything else happens, let us know. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. That word replayed in Vera's mind as she sat at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen. Was she misunderstanding? Or was she being manipulated? She needed to do something. That night, she changed her routine. Instead of heading straight home, she stopped at a well-lit cafe near the office and sat near the window, watching the street. She stayed there for nearly an hour, sipping coffee she didn't really want, waiting to see if someone would appear. And then she saw it. A figure, familiar yet out of place, just barely visible in the reflection of the glass. He was across the street, sitting on a bench, pretending to scroll through his phone. Her stomach clenched. It was subtle, so subtle that she could have dismissed it as coincidence. But it wasn't. Silas. He wasn't looking at her directly, but that was part of what made it terrifying. The casual way he sat, his posture too relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. Her hands gripped her coffee cup tightly, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to be sure. Vera reached for her phone and pretended to take a selfie, subtly angling it to capture the street behind her. When she glanced at the photo, her breath hitched. Silas was there, blurred in the background, still sitting in the exact same position. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. She had to get out of there. She grabbed her things and walked quickly out the door, heading toward the busiest street she could find. She didn't look back, didn't check if he was following. She kept walking until she reached the train station, breathless, heart pounding. Only when she boarded the train did she allow herself to glance behind her. He wasn't there, but that didn't mean he wasn't watching. The ride home was a blur. By the time she reached her apartment, she was shaking. Locking the door behind her, she exhaled sharply. Think, Vera. Think. She needed proof. Something undeniable. If she was going to go to HR or the police, she couldn't just say she felt watched. She needed evidence. That night, she installed a security camera outside her apartment door. She checked the locks 3 times. Then she sat in bed, phone in hand, staring at the screen, waiting for something to happen. And then, just past midnight, her phone buzzed. An email. From unknown subject. You can't hide. Her blood ran cold. Her fingers trembled as she clicked on the message. You're smarter than this, Vera. You know who to trust. And who not to. She felt sick. Her mind raced. Should she call the police? Tell someone? But what if they didn't believe her? What if this was all in her head? What if that was exactly what he wanted her to think? She had no answers. Only one certainty. She wasn't safe anymore. Vera barely slept that night. Every sound, every creak of her apartment sent a fresh jolt of fear through her system. She kept checking the security camera feed on her phone, waiting for someone to appear. But the hallway remained empty. By morning, exhaustion clung to her like a weight. She debated calling in sick, but dismissed the idea almost immediately. Staying home wouldn't make her feel any safer. If anything, it would give her more time to spiral into panic. No, she needed to act normal, needed to regain control. At work, she could hardly focus. Every interaction felt tainted with suspicion. Every glance from a coworker felt too prolonged. Every casual conversation sounded like it had a double meaning. And worst of all, Silas was watching. She caught him out of the corner of her eye multiple times, just lingering near her desk, pretending to be engaged in his work. But she knew better now. She knew what she was looking for. By lunch, she was ready to confront him. She found him alone in the break room, stirring a cup of coffee as if he had no worries in the world. Silas. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled at her sides. He turned, surprised. Hey, Vera. You okay? She hesitated. His tone was calm, friendly, too friendly. It made her stomach turn. Have you noticed anything strange lately? She asked carefully. Like, around the office? Silas frowned, as if he were deep in thought. Strange how? Vera studied his face, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign that he knew exactly what she was talking about. But his expression remained frustratingly neutral. I don't know, she said finally. Just weird messages. A feeling like I'm being watched. Silas tilted his head, as if considering her words. That sounds awful. You think someone's bothering you? Her throat tightened. Was he playing dumb? Or was he actually this good at pretending? I don't know yet, she admitted. But I'm going to find out. She thought she saw something, a flicker, a momentary shift in his demeanor. But it was gone before she could be sure. He took a sip of his coffee, then nodded. Well, if you need anything, he said. I'm here. Vera forced a tight smile before turning on her heel and walking away. She felt his gaze burning into her back the entire way out of the break room. That night, she checked her security camera footage again. And this time, she found something. At 2:37 a.m., just barely visible at the edge of the frame, Someone had been standing at the end of the hallway. Not moving, not approaching, just watching. Vera's stomach lurched as she rewound the footage again and again, trying to make out the figure's features. The angle was terrible, the light dim, but she could see the shape of a man. Tall, familiar. A fresh wave of terror crashed over her. She had been right all along. She was being watched. And now she had proof. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found Grant's name. She hesitated, biting her lip. They hadn't spoken much since things had gotten weird between them. But right now, she needed help. She needed someone to tell her she wasn't losing her mind. She pressed the call button. He answered on the third ring. Vera. Her voice came out shaky. Grant, I think someone's following me. A pause. Then, firm and steady. I'm on my way. Grant arrived at Vera's apartment in less than 20 minutes. She barely had time to process the shock of what she had seen on the security footage before he was knocking at her door. When she opened it, she was met with concern etched deep into his features. Vera, what's going on? He asked, stepping inside without hesitation. She gestured to her laptop, still open to the paused security footage. Grant leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied the shadowy figure lingering at the end of the hallway. That's eerie, he admitted. You don't recognize him? Vera shook her head. I can't see his face, but I have a feeling I know who it is. Grant glanced at her. Who? She hesitated. Saying Silas' name out loud felt like crossing an invisible boundary, like finally admitting to herself just how deeply he had embedded himself into her life. Silas, she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. Grant straightened, running a hand through his hair. The guy from work? Yes, Vera said. He's been around me a lot. Too much. I keep getting these emails, anonymous ones, warning me about people I trust. And then this footage. She gestured helplessly at the screen. Grant exhaled, thinking. We need to do something about this. I went to HR, she told him. But there wasn't much they could do. They said to come back if something else happened. This is something else happening, Vera, Grant said firmly. You have proof now. You need to go to the police. Vera swallowed hard. What if I'm wrong? What if it's not him? Grant shook his head. And what if it is? If we do nothing, this could get worse. Vera knew he was right. She had spent too much time second-guessing herself. It was time to act. She took a deep breath and reached for her phone. I'm calling the police. The officers arrived within the hour. They moved with an air of quiet professionalism, their presence filling Vera's apartment with a gravity she hadn't felt before. 2 detectives, one in his late 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, the other younger, quieter, taking notes, listened as she recounted everything. The messages, the shadow in the footage, the persistent feeling that someone was always watching. Detective Harris, the senior of the two, leaned back slightly as he processed her words. You said you have a suspicion about who it might be? Vera swallowed hard. Yes. His name is Silas Kendrick. We work together. He's always there. Every time I turn around, he's standing nearby. He always finds excuses to talk to me, to linger. It started off as just friendly, but after a while, I realized he was learning everything about me. My schedule, my routines, my favorite places. Harris's partner, Detective Reeves, wrote furiously in his notepad. And the emails? You're sure they started after you noticed his behavior? Yes, Vera nodded. At first, they seemed vague, like some random spam, but then they became personal. Like someone was warning me about things before they even happened. Harris exchanged a glance with Reeves before nodding. We'll need to speak with him. The thought made Vera's stomach twist with unease. And what if it is him? What if questioning him makes things worse? Harris studied her for a moment before responding. We handle these situations carefully. If he's been stalking you, he may escalate, especially if he senses you're pulling away or pushing back. Vera's throat went dry. What should I do? For now, Harris said, keep your routine as normal as possible, but be extra cautious. Lock your doors. Avoid being alone if you can. And if you see him somewhere unexpected, somewhere he has no reason to be, you call us immediately. Grant, who had been standing near the doorway the entire time, stepped forward, his jaw tight. And if she needs protection? If this guy does something? We'll take it seriously, Reeves assured him. But we need solid evidence first. The security footage helps, but unless we get direct proof that he's threatening her, we can't file charges yet. A restraining order might be possible, but only if we establish a clear pattern of unwanted contact. Vera exhaled shakily. So you're saying until he does something worse, you can't stop him? Harris's gaze softened just slightly. I know it's frustrating, but we're not dismissing this. We've seen cases like this before. Sometimes confronting a stalker makes them back off, but sometimes it makes them bolder. That sent a chill through Vera's spine. She hadn't thought about that possibility. What if Silas saw this as a challenge? Harris reached into his pocket and handed her a card. My direct number. Call if anything changes. Day or night. Vera took it with a trembling hand. Thank you. As the officers left, she turned to Grant, who was watching her with a serious expression. This isn't over, he murmured. She nodded, hugging her arms around herself. I know. That night she barely slept. She replayed every moment of the past few weeks, trying to pinpoint when things had turned from unsettling to outright terrifying. Had it been the first time she caught Silas watching her from across the office? Or was it before that, when he somehow knew her favorite cafe without her ever mentioning it? She tossed and turned, checking her phone every few minutes, half expecting another email to appear. Then, at 3:12 a.m., her security camera app sent an alert. Her breath caught as she clicked on the notification. Movement detected. The video loaded, and her stomach dropped. A figure, standing at the very edge of the frame. Still, motionless, watching her door. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he stepped back into the shadows. Vera gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to focus, but her heart was pounding too fast. This was real. He was here. Her fingers shook as she dialed Detective Harris's number. When he picked up, she didn't wait for pleasantries. He was here, she whispered. Outside my apartment. I have it on video. There was a pause before Harris responded, voice steely and controlled. Stay inside. Lock your doors. We're on our way. Vera hung up and slowly backed away from the window, pressing herself against the wall. The fear was suffocating, thick and unrelenting. But one thing was crystal clear now. This wasn't just stalking anymore. This was a warning. Vera sat on the edge of her couch, staring at the security footage on her phone, heart hammering in her chest. The shadowy figure that had stood outside her door for those agonizing seconds had been unmistakable. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't tried to enter. He had simply stood there, watching, before slipping away into the darkness. Her stomach twisted with fear. Silas was no longer lurking at the edges of her life. He was stepping into it. Within 15 minutes, the police arrived. Detective Harris was the first one through the door, his sharp eyes scanning the apartment before settling on her. Show me. Vera handed him her phone, and he watched the video in silence. After a moment, he sighed. This is enough to escalate things. We can request a formal protection order. Grant, who had been sitting nearby, tensed. And until then, what if he comes back? We're going to take steps to prevent that, Harris assured them. He looked at Vera. Pack a bag. You shouldn't stay here tonight. She shivered. Where am I supposed to go? You have any family nearby? She shook her head. Not close. Grant straightened. She can stay at my place. Vera turned to him in surprise. Grant, You shouldn't be alone, he interrupted gently. Just for tonight, at least. She hesitated, but the alternative was too terrifying to consider. Finally, she nodded. Okay. Harris looked at her seriously. We'll post a patrol near your apartment overnight. If anything happens, you call us immediately. Vera swallowed hard. Thank you. An hour later, she was sitting in Grant's guest room, staring at the duffel bag of hastily packed clothes. The weight of the night pressed down on her, exhaustion creeping into her bones, but sleep felt impossible. A knock at the door startled her. Vera! She opened it to find Grant standing there, arms crossed. You okay? She gave him a weak smile. Not really. Grant sighed, leaning against the doorframe. I don't get it. Why is he doing this? What does he want? Vera shook her head. Control. Attention. I don't know. But he's not going to stop until someone forces him to. Grant's jaw clenched. Then we force him. She exhaled shakily. Harris said he'd try to escalate things. Maybe that'll scare him off. Grant didn't look convinced. And if it doesn't? Vera met his eyes. Then I won't keep running. I won't let him win. She wanted to believe her own words. She needed to. But deep down, she knew the worst was still to come. And Silas wasn't done with her yet. The morning light filtered through the blinds in Grant's guest room, casting sharp lines across the walls. Vera sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone. No new emails. No security alerts. No anonymous messages. Silas hadn't made a move. That should have reassured her. It didn't. Grant had already left for work, promising to check in throughout the day. He had insisted she take more time off, stay somewhere safe. But Vera couldn't let fear dictate her life. If she let Silas control where she went and what she did, then he had already won. She took a deep breath and made a decision. She would go back to work. The office felt different. The tension hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Her co-workers stole glances at her, whispering among themselves. They knew. She had hoped this could be handled quietly, but rumors had spread. People knew about the police being called to her apartment. Knew that she had filed a restraining order. And worse, they knew it was Silas. She kept her head down as she walked to her desk, trying to ignore the way conversations hushed as she passed. Her inbox was clear. No strange notes. No cryptic messages. But the silence was almost more unsettling than the stalking itself. Then, just before lunch, she saw him. Silas was standing near the break room, talking casually with a coworker, as if nothing had changed. As if he wasn't the reason she had spent the last few nights afraid to be alone. Her stomach twisted. Why was he still here? Hadn't he been spoken to by the police? Didn't he realize she knew exactly what he was doing? Then, as if he sensed her staring, he turned. Their eyes met across the office. Vera's breath hitched. Silas smiled. A knowing, confident smile. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. She turned away quickly, forcing herself to focus on her work. She wouldn't let him get to her. Not again. By the time she left the office that evening, she was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her paranoia in overdrive. When she reached her apartment building, she hesitated. Would he be waiting? Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to move forward. But as she stepped inside, something felt off. The air in her apartment felt wrong. She checked the locks, secure. The windows, untouched. But then she saw it. A single white envelope on the kitchen counter. Vera's stomach dropped. She hadn't left that there. Someone had been inside. Her hands trembled as she picked up the envelope and slowly opened it. The note inside was written in clean, deliberate handwriting. You think a piece of paper will keep me away? I'll always be close. The room spun. Her breath came in short gasps as she stumbled backward, her mind screaming at her to run. How had he gotten in? She had changed the locks. She had security cameras. How? Her phone slipped from her grip as she scrambled to call someone, anyone. Finally, she dialed Detective Harris's number with shaking fingers. He was here, she gasped the moment he answered. Inside my apartment. He left a note. Get out, Harris ordered. Don't touch anything. We're sending officers now. Vera ran out of the apartment, barely stopping to grab her bag. She rushed down the hallway, not daring to look back, not daring to breathe until she was outside. She paced on the sidewalk, heart hammering. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights pulled up to the curb. Harris stepped out of the police car, his expression grim. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Show me the note. With trembling hands, Vera handed it to him. He read it, his jaw tightening. You're sure nothing else is missing or out of place? She shook her head. Just the note. That's what makes it worse. He didn't take anything. He just wanted me to know he was here. Harris sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. This changes things. We'll check the security footage, see how he got in. Vera's stomach twisted. And if he comes back? Harris's eyes darkened. We'll be ready for him. That night, she stayed at Grant's again. She didn't trust being alone. Not when she knew that Silas had been inside her home, in her personal space. She sat on the couch, knees pulled to her chest. Grant brought her tea, but she barely touched it. You should try to get some sleep, he murmured, sitting beside her. Vera let out a weak laugh. How am I supposed to sleep knowing he can get to me whenever he wants? Grant hesitated before reaching out and gently squeezing her hand. You're not alone in this. Vera looked at him, something warm and grounding in his gaze. It was the first time all day that she felt like she wasn't drowning. But deep down she knew. Silas wasn't done. And the next time, he wouldn't just leave a note. Vera didn't sleep that night. Even with Grant in the next room, even knowing that Detective Harris and his team were actively investigating, she couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. Silas had been inside her home. There were no broken locks, no signs of forced entry, which meant one thing. He had a way in that she didn't know about. She sat curled on the couch, clutching her phone, waiting for another notification, another email, another whisper from the shadows that he was still watching. But nothing came, and that terrified her more than anything. When morning arrived, she forced herself to shower and change, but the exhaustion hung heavy in her body. Grant made her coffee, his presence grounding but unable to erase the fear sitting in her chest. "We need to figure out how he got in," she muttered. "He's not just watching anymore. He's proving a point. He's telling me he can get to me anytime he wants." Grant set his mug down a little too hard. "And that's exactly why we can't let this go on." Vera glanced at him. "What are you thinking?" "I think we need to bait him." Her stomach twisted. "Grant, no. That's dangerous. But it's the only way to prove beyond doubt that it's him," Grant pressed. "He's getting bolder. If we wait too long, he's going to take things even further." Vera clenched her jaw. He was right. If they just reacted, they would always be one step behind. They needed to force Silas to make a mistake. She exhaled slowly. "What do you have in mind?" Grant hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "We set up a controlled scenario. You go back to your apartment, but not alone. We'll have police nearby watching. If he tries to approach, if he tries to get inside again, we catch him in the act." The idea sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Vera, but she forced herself to consider it rationally. If they caught Silas in the act, they could put an end to this. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, let's do it." Detective Harris was hesitant at first, but after some deliberation, he agreed. "We'll have undercover officers stationed outside and inside the building," he explained. "You go in as usual. Act normal. If he approaches, we take him in. Normal, like she hadn't spent the past few weeks living in fear." That evening, Vera stood outside her apartment building, her heart hammering against her ribs. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. She swallowed hard and glanced at Grant, who stood a few feet away. He gave her a reassuring nod. She turned the key in the lock, stepping inside. The apartment was cold and still. Too still. She left the lights off, walking carefully toward the living room, her fingers trembling as she set her keys down on the counter. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight, waiting. Then a sound, a faint click behind her. Her breath caught. Slowly she turned. The closet door, her bedroom closet, was slightly ajar. A cold, paralyzing fear gripped her chest. He was inside. She forced herself to stay calm. This is what they were waiting for. Swallowing down her panic, she took a slow step backward toward the door. She needed to get out. She needed to signal the officers outside. Then, a hand shot out from the darkness. She barely had time to scream before fingers closed around her wrist, yanking her off balance. "Vera," a voice whispered too close. Too familiar. She twisted, heart racing, thrashing against the grip. "Shoo," Silas whispered. "You don't have to be afraid." Terror surged through her. She had to get out. She stomped down hard on his foot, jerking her arm free as he let out a surprised grunt. "Run! Now!" She bolted for the door, but Silas recovered quickly, grabbing for her again. Then the front door burst open. Shouts filled the air. Officers swarmed in. Silas barely had time to react before they were on him, tackling him to the ground. Vera stumbled back, gasping, watching as they pinned him down. His face was turned toward her, his expression twisted in something that wasn't quite anger. It was disappointment. "You shouldn't have done this, Vera," he murmured, his voice eerily calm even as they cuffed his hands behind his back. "I was only trying to protect you." Her stomach lurched. Protect her? She had no words, no breath left in her lungs. She just watched as the officers dragged him out, his eyes never leaving hers until the moment he disappeared down the hall. She was shaking. Grant caught her by the shoulders, steadying her. "It's over," he whispered. Vera wasn't sure she believed that. Not yet, but for the first time in weeks, she finally felt like she could breathe. The silence that followed Silas's arrest was unlike anything Vera had ever experienced. It wasn't just relief, it was a void, a space where fear had once lived, filling her every thought, her every step. Now that he was gone, taken into custody, she found herself waiting for the fear to return, for the paranoia to creep back in. But it didn't. For the first time in weeks, Vera stepped into her apartment and felt safe. Grant was with her, his presence steady, grounding. He had insisted on staying the night, even though she no longer needed protection. The police had confirmed that Silas would remain in custody, charged with multiple counts of stalking, unlawful entry, and violating a protection order. He wouldn't be able to come near her again. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she just felt tired. "I don't even know what to do with myself," she admitted, running a hand through her hair as she stood in her kitchen, staring blankly at the counter. The same counter where she had found Silas's note. The memory sent a shiver through her, but it was different now. It was over. Grant leaned against the doorway. "You start moving forward, one step at a time." She exhaled a slow breath. "How do I do that?" He shrugged. "By remembering that you won." A small, weak smile tugged at her lips. She wasn't sure she felt like a winner, but maybe that would come in time. The trial was straightforward. Silas had no excuses, no real defense. His lawyer argued that he had suffered from delusions and obsessive tendencies, that his actions had been motivated by a misguided belief that he was protecting Vera. Vera listened to every word, sitting in the front row of the courtroom watching him. Silas didn't meet her eyes. Maybe he finally understood. Maybe he finally realized that what he had done was wrong. Or maybe he just didn't like losing. The verdict came swiftly: guilty. He was sentenced to several years in prison, with a restraining order that would last a lifetime. It was over. Really, truly over. The first morning Vera woke up without fear, without checking her security cameras, without waiting for the next email, she cried. Not out of sadness, but because she was free. Grant had been right. Moving forward wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about reclaiming her life. And so, step by step, that's exactly what she did. She started therapy, working through the trauma, unraveling the fear Silas had woven into her life. She went back to work, reclaiming her space. The office felt different without him there, but in the best way possible. She could breathe again. She even moved apartments, not because she was running, but because she wanted a fresh start. And one day, months later, as she walked down the street, feeling the sun on her face, the wind in her hair, she realized she wasn't looking over her shoulder anymore. She had won. She had survived. And most importantly, she was finally free.